what can go wrong if you're either training a model or giving a model reference data that is from historical data in your company. There's going to be human bias in that, or there's going to be human bias in all that data. So you can't help that you may have had international team of recruiters, but they each had their own bias, and maybe that groups together against a bias against women or minorities, and that is picked up. So that sort of training data or reference material is skewed from the get-go.
Yeah, I was going to say, I read when Elon Musk was training their cars, it's all on millions of hours of video data. And that's how they're able to make a pretty big jump in one of their last self-driving programs that they released. And what was interesting, they said, is that it'll teach the car to avoid objects and do that. But there are certain habits that it picked up from humans being poor drivers.
I wouldn't want it to be the case whereas government rulings come out and restrictions, and you must declare all your sources of data, and you got to make sure that everything is sanitized and unbiased and ethical, that it gets so constrictive that it takes a huge amount of data we'll be able to use before to like a very tiny set, and models that come out in the future are almost like dumbed down in a way because of that. So I can go through to the next one, which is model poisoning. So this is interesting too. So during the training phase, attackers can introduce malicious data that poisons the model, leading to compromised performance or biased outputs. So that is extremely interesting, because if let's say that OpenAI is scraping Stack Overflow, for instance, to get all its training material, you could very easily, introduce complete malicious data into that, or trying to think of a better example. Or let's say that it's scraping a demographic database on, let's say, people and their financial status, and you could go and manipulate that to make certain groups of people look like their financial status is different to reality, some weird malicious thing like that. I'm sure you can think of many examples where it's basically
medical records.
Yeah, that's a good one too.
Medical record.
Yeah. So anything that you feel like your business, let's say, could get an advantage of if OpenAI thinks a certain way on that data. So let's say something simpler like shipping lanes, right? You could, if you know that OpenAI is scraping certain shipping databases, and if you know that you can somehow get into that and manipulate it, you can make certain lanes look extremely expensive according to model, and your lanes look extremely cheap and efficient and the best lanes to use. And so when someone asks, I want to ship my product from Australia to Amsterdam, what's the best shipping carrier to use? Oh, certainly yours is getting recommended as, this is known to be, the most efficient and cost effective shipping service to use, or something interesting like that. So it's all about knowing and figuring out where the models are pulling their data from and then manipulating at that point.
But that's manipulating the data that is being scraped from. I mean, it's scraped. So at a macro level, you're kind of going out and you're adding content onto the internet to skew the interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure that's even being done at a global level.
Yeah.
If, politically, I don't want to go tangent into that side of things, but very easily, you can have a load of comments on all the social media sites with a certain political perception, and the model then overall starts thinking, if Facebook's trying to train their models on all their users, it might go a certain slant that yes, most users agree with this political stance, and that's just what it thinks, but it's not true at all because the source data has been manipulated. Yeah. So interesting consideration and specific to that.
Yeah,
I don't know if you remember, I'm sure people all know black hat SEO techniques to trick Google's algorithm to get ranked, whether that's, same font color as the background, so you don't see all this big page of keyword loading and things like that. I mean, is it where I could start talking bad shit about another company? Oh, they're a horrible company. You don't want to deal with them. And it's all just hidden within like small files that no one can see.
Yeah.
But somehow it influences the search results in AI and Google. I don't know.
Yeah. That's
isn't this the next front of optimization, I guess, that we're going into? And we're in those early days by the sounds of it, where you can influence things. It's going to be interesting to see what policies are put in place. I know there are a lot of different governments working on a lot of different policies to prevent things like this. So it's a space for
we'll
kind
get
of
into that, into some ethical discussions.
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
Well, that's our next gotcha. But I don't know, Joe, if you're finished, because that would be a sweet segue. But I'm sure you got a few more.
I got one or two more, just one more maybe, which is kind of interesting because, again, it's very specific to the AI space, which is what the examples I'm trying to come up with outside of just general IT security. And this is called model inversion attacks. So attackers can use the AI model to reverse engineer and infer sensitive information from the training data. So what that means is that if you're able to get a model that another company's created, and they created it from sensitive data or, data very specific to their business, for instance, that they don't necessarily want everyone to use, but they want it in the model, and maybe they felt that they've, constructed the model in a way, and their prompts and their layers ahead of that will stop anyone trying to get access to that sensitive information, but they can still ask questions broadly on it, for instance. But what that means is if someone is able to get that model, they can then start reverse engineering it and actually trying to see, how was this model actually trained, and actually start pulling out the data that was used to be trained with, rather than, just trying to get to that source data directly. Because that's not something that you think about. It's sort of going at a model from the, output back into what it was actually trained from. So interesting perception on how you actually solve that, because you can pour your layers that you want in front of that. But if someone can, reverse engineer it, then they can get that data themselves, which is, interesting use case. You may think that again, I think it even comes more into a side of that you've got databases that you've created, and it's cost you a lot of money to create those databases, and you create a model based on those databases. And again, you may think that, okay, well, the model is something that people can use, but the data is really what makes, what gives us the ability to produce this model, and we can have our business focused around that maybe. But if someone's able to reverse engineer it, they can get that data themselves and create their own models based on it, which is kind of stealing your data in a weird way.
I think I heard people who use Slack had some issues where I've heard in the news where Slack was leveraging ChatGPT, but then you have access to a lot of conversations that are private and sensitive. I don't know if you heard anything about that.
I think it's a common problem. So that just comes into the side of things that when you use an AI service, you got to make sure that they're not using that data themselves for their own model or storing it off somewhere. It should just answer the question, and then they shouldn't hold on to that data or use it from that point onwards. And I think that those were like the early days of a lot of companies falling into that issue, where they would just go to ChatGPT and paste all their source code, proprietary source code into it, and ask questions, not realizing that source code is now being uploaded into OpenAI. So that's a huge thing that I think, especially around privacy, even sensitive information, again, so like hospital records that you think may, you think you may have scraped enough information out of to make it anonymous, but really, if someone spends enough time, they can probably pull it out and infer, what hospital this data came from or something like that. So a lot of privacy around that, concerns that you need to look into. It kind of goes into bias too, same topic, and I think, Bryn, maybe you're going to dive into that, but.
Yeah, I guess that's our third kind of gotcha of this is model accuracy and bias. And just to unpack those as well quickly, is what is model accuracy, and that really refers to how well an AI model performs its intended task. So higher the accuracy really means that the model's predictions or kind of classifications are correct most of the time. And then I'm sure we're all aware of kind of bias. But I think the bias in models occurs when the AI model kind of makes these systematic errors that favor certain groups or outcomes. So sort of portrays a bias. And that can be from a number of reasons that we'll look at. But I think, just looking at things like, bias detection, looking at your data quality, and again, monitoring. If we sort of look at a scenario where, imagine we had a recruitment company, and that recruitment company thinks, this AI model is going to help us. It's going to remove the bias from the sort of human interaction in the recruitment process. So it can look at your resumes and it can say, we're not going to project any of our own kind of bias onto that. We're going to have a very neutral, hiring process and streamlined one, and that you can even go and advertise. Well, we've created this whole kind of fair and efficient evaluation process, that it's going to be free of human biases. But scenarios like that, at first everything could seem great. It's hiring, it's recommending really great candidates. But without monitoring, a few months down the line, you realize, wait a minute, there's a bit of a disturbing pattern emerging that it's only it's very few women and it's very few minorities that are actually being listed as candidates. And, suddenly you've got a massive potential PR hazard on your hands. And, if you look at what can go wrong, it is really, if you're either training a model or giving a model reference data that is from historical data in your company, there's going to be human, bias in that, or there's going to be human bias in all that data. So you can't help that you may have had international team of recruiters, but they each had their own bias, and maybe that groups together against a bias against women or minorities, and that is picked up. So that sort of training data or reference material is skewed from the get-go. So you're really just seeing it sort of manifesting these issues from the original data. So it's really important, I think, to ensure that if you're using training data, that you've reviewed it for these sort of, the existence of kind of known biases, and make sure that there's not an unnoticed bias that's going there that will eventually come out, because it's really only as good as the sort of data that you're feeding it. So if you are giving a model data, make sure that maybe it's broader, it's maybe even including recruitment information outside of your company, just general trends to try and offset that bias.
Yeah, I was going to say, I read when Elon Musk was training their cars, it's all on millions of hours of video data. And that's how they're able to make a pretty big jump in one of their last self-driving programs that they released. And what was interesting, they said, is that it'll teach the car to avoid objects and do that. But there are certain habits that it picked up from humans being poor drivers that it would make mistakes at certain, like when it comes to a yellow, it speeds up or I'm not sure if that was an actual thing, but certain bad habits that commonly are done by humans. Was training the car to do the same things. So that's
you just see hit a traffic jam and the car just swings into the emergency lane. It's like, what's it doing? I am getting you there quicker.
It starts honking and yelling at the person in front of you and has a middle finger that sticks out.
Flashes the lights and stop it. Yes, don't do that. Oh no. So I think the key takeaways on this section is really data diversity. Is make sure that it's your data comes from a lot of different sources and is representative of the broader sort of population to prevent any bias. You got to monitor and audit. Make sure that you got a handle on what it's doing and try and pick up on patterns before they run and are used, should I say, for decisions. Over a series of weeks or months. And I think transparency is big. And this is a point that I know we've tried to make very clear in a lot of the solutions we're developing, is let the user know this is an AI-based decision. AI is not perfect yet. It's helping amazingly, but be transparent about what it's doing and the processes it's following, so everyone is aware of actually what's happening there. And I think the last is inclusive design as well. Just make sure that there's not a single person that is making the decision on that data, because we all hold our own bias, and you don't want to think, no, I think this is perfectly good, that this data is skewed and it happens to align with that person's bias, and that goes out. So I think involving a diverse team, getting a lot of eyes on it and making that call as to, is this representative of as unbiased data as possible. And that's everything I have for that. But if anyone has anything to add.
No, I was wondering, that's a interesting segue, because there's some topics around ethics and considerations, especially around transparency, bias, and things like that. So I don't know if that's a good segue to go into that. Gotcha.
I think so. Yeah. You want to take that away, Makoto, and then we can loop back to the last one after that.
I could definitely talk around that. With the ethics, and you were just talking about transparency. Obviously, there's governing bodies that are trying to be set up. We have the GDPR, but that's more around data. I think there's definitely more governing bodies that have to be developed, or there's starts of some. I think the IIIE has some ethic guidelines around AI, but the transparency of where that data is coming from is so important, where the source is coming from. Because I know that's a big issue where I know Google results, they'll kind of show or sort the sources. They'll cite those sources. Same with ChatGPT. On certain things, they'll cite the sources as well. I don't know if you've used Poe. That was the one from Quora. So Quora is a big website where a lot of people put their input in there. And I actually started to do a lot of that a while ago. And when I heard they were going to use Poe as an AI to pull all the information, but right away there's a big uproar about citing the sources, because they weren't citing sources of where it was getting the answers from. It was just say, this is what we've gathered. And so that was pretty unfair for the amount of, some people are obviously doing it for the attention. Obviously it helps put you as the expert in that question or field or whatever it is. And so there's definitely some ethical challenges around that, if they're not citing the right source, where it's coming from. And maybe there's something more where could be developed as far as a confidence level. Maybe there's only one source or one thing, and it can somehow say, this is a data point of one, be careful, or whatever. I'm not sure what your guys' thoughts are on that.
Yeah. I think it does need to, sourcing is important, and you hope that in all the algorithms that are built into these models, there would be something saying that if you found it from a single source, then it's not necessarily something you should quote. If you have 10 sources that all say the same thing, they're all different, reputable ones. And I think Joe and I have had a discussion on really the future of AI-driven data, and just how we almost need to have recognized sources of information that are trusted. So, at the moment, you kind of try and apply critical thinking to anything on the internet. You say, well, what is the source of this? Can the source be trusted? But we almost need resources that are, so almost you think of a Wikipedia, where, someone has to go and approve potentially that article, and, you have eyes on that data. So there are a number of, coming back to that data diversity as well, that point that we just mentioned. If we can develop reputable sources of information where everything is fact-checked, then facts should be pulled from those and said, right, this is verified, or this is completely unverified, take it with a pinch of salt. I don't know how much of that is happening at the moment. And I don't know kind of what we're talking about in a recent podcast with the emergent behavior. You do wonder how much has actually been thought out, and we're not just riding on this wave of, wow, look what this can do. Let's run with it. You hope that there are the proper decisions. And I think that's maybe where these government legislations to slow things down a little bit is coming from, and the fact that, let's get all of this right the first time. Let's not run too far with models that we haven't verified, how information is coming out of them, and, where that information is coming from.
Yeah, I'll add in a different perception on that too, though, in a way. I'm not advocating it, just thinking of it differently. Again, one of the amazing things about the models at the moment is that, the more data that you feed them, almost like the smarter they are, and that emergent behavior comes out. And I think, just the power of just being able to add more and more and more data, and just add everything that you can think of, and it just, becomes an amazing model, has been probably one of the biggest things that sort of, kicked AI into high gear recently. And I am kind of like concerned, or just sort of interested to see, I wouldn't want it to be the case whereas, government rulings come out and restrictions, and you must, declare all your sources of data, and, you got to make sure that everything is sanitized and unbiased and ethical, that it gets so constrictive that, it takes a huge amount of data we'll be able to use before to like a very tiny set. And models that come out in the future are almost like dumbed down in a way because of that. I don't know what your guys' thoughts on that, but that would be a concern of mine, that as things tighten up, it just sort of negatively impacts the models overall.
Well, that's stifling innovation. And I think what we'll find is legislation is obviously country specific. So there's so many different places that can be set up that, where there's less legislation. And so I don't think we'll ever stop it, but maybe it's a case of, larger disclaimers and more transparency again, coming back to, we don't really know where all these sources have come from, but this is the best bet. Fact check it. And until we've got a source that can, so almost, I guess I'm thinking of it like feature development. This is a new feature in the models. We can verify that this has been fact checked on 3, 4, 5 plus independent sites, to give you a well-rounded, unbiased opinion, which maybe doesn't happen at the moment. And as you were saying, like the fact that you can manipulate sources on the internet in a large enough scale to skew the data on something, I think maybe that's an approach it will go, because I don't see the momentum stopping. Just looking at the news today with NVIDIA just expanding out its production facilities and its sort of AI processing facilities. It's incredible, and they're massive. Manufacturing and sort of AI farms that are kind of being created. So it's I think it is full steam ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned about the countries. So the EU is coming out with it's called the EU AI Act. It's a piece of legislation aimed at ensuring AI is safe and beneficial. It employs a risk-based approach categorizing AI applications into unacceptable high and low to minimal risk categories. So they're doing something there, and there's an AI liability directive where people are compensated if you get hurt or injured by AI. UK is doing something as well. So there are countries that are trying to do something from a global standpoint, but obviously concerns with Russia, China, North Korea, those where those ethics aren't, probably it could be a problem. So that would be interesting on how they follow those standards. If you're in a car and then you've got a child and a mother walking on one side of the street and 3 other older people walking on the other side of the street, and there's a car coming straight at you and you have to swerve, and you got to hit somebody or you got to kill the driver. Which one do you choose? How does it choose? You as a human, if you choose either one and you hit somebody, that's called an accident. You're not going to be charged with murder. But if an AI makes that decision, it's almost like they're saying it's not an accident then. It's purposely made that decision.